Greetings, this is Eugene the philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert Dynamiland, the greatest living philosopher before me. Let us talk about medicine a little bit, shall we? And by a little bit, as usual, more or less, I mean like 70 or 80 minutes, or how long would this video take? We'll see. So, and here I want to continue this line of reasoning that I've started in my video Nature of Knowledge, where I basically state that any knowledge is really just a bunch of stories connected into networks, etc., etc. So in this particular video, I wish to apply this approach and examine the stories that lie behind the medicine, right? So I shall try to explicate the cultural patterns that lie in and around the field of medicine, let's say. So what is medicine anyway? I would say that it's a field of theory and practice aimed at treatment of people. And here I should make a caveat that it's really not only people, and later on, if we'll survive, near the end of this video, I'll give an example of treatment of not people. But so far we'll focus on people, okay? Just to illustrate the whole point. So, as you might have seen, again, the key words here are treatment and people. So, let us consider them for a moment. My point here, in general, in this video, would be that the main thing in medicine is the construction of three norms. What I should call them, what I would call them. The norm of health, that's the one norm. The norm of disease, that's the other one. And the norm of therapy, that's the third one. So, health, what I call the norm of health, is exactly that. It's the people, which I've included in my definition of medicine. So, we cannot treat anyone if we don't know the norm, you know, if we don't know the desired result of treatment. So, we should, in some sense, set this norm a priori, like prior to any sort of experience, right? We should set it as a value, you know, as like something that we strive for, or something to that effect. So we should construct this normal human and use it as a beacon for us to orient ourselves, essentially. So, and obviously this norm, this first norm that we're talking about currently, is connected, like the very picture of this norm is connected to culture, to the general networks that exist in particular culture of particular time and place, let's say. And in these networks are integrated politics, laws, religion, ethics and philosophy and economy and lifestyle and, well, culture in general, right? So, because human, obviously, is at the center of all those things, right? So, the norm of human should relate to all of them simultaneously, in this sense. And, well, one example we might think about is, for example, homosexuality. Which is, well, sort of like a typical example in these kinds of discussions that in some societies with certain arrangement of these cultural networks, let's say homosexuality would be considered not normal, but in other types of societies it would be considered normal, right? So in some societies, let's say medicine might try to treat you from homosexuality, whereas in others it wouldn't. Right, so there you go. It's a very clear illustration of my point. So, and funny thing about it is that the prevalence of, let's say, homosexual behavior doesn't really matter in this case. Like, you can probably make a solid point. I'm not sure that you can, but probably you can, that in most societies the prevalence is roughly the same. I mean, of that type of behavior, but I mean, even in the most so-called conservative ones, you know, where it is like outright banned, it doesn't mean there's less homosexuals there. It just means that they cannot express their own sexuality openly, let's say. So yeah, and there were a couple of interesting scandals where, you know, advocates for heterosexual nuclear family in the United States, I think, turned out to be gay themselves. So yeah, it doesn't really matter. What matters is how all these other cultural structures arranged around all of that, like the political and religious and scientific, etc. So does all of that allow homosexuality be normal or not? Basically, that's what I'm saying. So yeah, that would determine whether we should treat this or not. So again, it's just my illustration of the way how the norm of human, the norm of health, the norm of health is constructed, right? So it's not preset. It's something that we artificially insert into the world in some sense, or at least in our culture. But obviously this one norm is not enough to start treatment, right? We need to have at least the second norm, which I call the norm of disease. And in particular, so with the norm of health, we have the understanding of the destination, if you like, where we should arrive eventually to this normal state. But we have no idea how to arrive there, right? So we have to map some routes. And this second norm, the norm of disease, is exactly that. It shows us how, let's say, well, okay, I'll just focus on how it is constructed. So we accumulate, let's say, typical traits of how human beings differ from this preset norm that we have already constructed, right? So we accumulate these differences, like we compare people to this norm, etc., and basically pack those accumulated differences into those sort of impenetrable black boxes. So we say that, okay, well, there's a very prevalent, let's say, difference in all of humans, or at least in a large quantity of humans from the norm, and we tag it with some name and we like pack it into a black box, right? This sort of difference, and we call this difference a disease or illness or sickness or whatever. So when we have those black boxes tagged and collected, we can perform diagnostics, for example. So we can compare a particular human being to the norm, and we can try to find from our catalog of our black boxes / diseases if there is if it fits some of those black boxes, this particular difference of this particular human being from our constructed norm. And so we can then invoke a diagnosis. Like we can say, well, you know, you have X, Y, and Z, you know, a disease of whatever type, whatever kind of disease, basically, right? We can identify the disease when we have already constructed it. Like we have already prepared those black boxes with tags, etc. So yeah, so that's the construction of the second norm. And well, the thing I didn't finish talking about previously was that the way it's thought about, it's not like how can we return to the norm. It's rather, can we build a plausible scenario of how this particular person deviated from the norm to their current state, right? So that's what disease is all about, basically. It's a particular route that takes you from, route means road, not route, you know, that takes you from the norm to the current state, basically. So we catalog all those possible routes by, again, accumulating differences from observations of many human beings. But again, that's not enough if we know the destination and the route from the destination to here, let's say. We need to know the route back, if you like, how to bring a person back to the norm. Again, the completely mythical and constructed norm. So we need to construct the third norm, which is the norm of therapy. And again, it's kind of secondary. In some sense, you might say you just need to move backwards along the same route or something to that effect. But still, it's technically necessary, the norm of therapy, because for many obvious reasons. So we need to revert the changes in the norm of health caused by normal disease that we have already cataloged, etc., etc. So when we have all of that made, we are more or less ready for practicing medicine, right? When we have all those three norms constructed. The norm of health, the norm of disease, which means hypothetically how this particular human being deviates from norm, and the norm of therapy, which means how we can move him or her back to the norm, right? So that's basically the whole field of medicine is only about those three things. And so we're ready for practicing medicine and teaching medicine even. We can like open our own medical schools or something like that once we have all those three things established. So like when we know what a human is, that's the first norm, like normal human. What are his diseases, the second norm. And how can we fight those diseases? That's the third norm. And I would claim that it's the general approach of culture towards medicine. Like it's the most, how do you say it? Like the most general type of medicine, let's say. Again, I'm kind of repeating myself, but who cares? And maybe it's not only human characteristic, maybe all kinds of like sentient beings would have this sort of medicine. I don't know. It's like I'm kind of referencing my video Onion of Aliens, where I've tried to describe what alien culture might look like, even though I failed, but never mind. So yeah, so basically it describes, this pattern describes all types of medicine, like traditional or like evidence-based modern medicine, whatever. All of them kind of move on the same rails, if you like. And the difference arises only in particular forms, particular realizations of any of those three norms or all of them together. Well, they're actually connected, so yeah, it's mostly all of them together. Like, for example, speaking about the first norm, the norm of health, what a human being is, etc. Well, you might represent a human being as a bunch of molecules, let's say. That would be one vision, one type of norm. Or you might represent a human being as a bunch of like 4 liquids, as Hippocrates did and like ancient doctors. Or you might represent a human being as a bunch of spirits who kind of in competition with each other, etc. Or as like a conglomerate of psychoenergetic chakras or something like that. Or you might represent a human being as an antenna that sort of catches the waves from the universe or something like that. So all of those pictures of this norm of a human being would obviously lead you to recognizing different types of diseases, right? So the second norm would be heavily influenced by your first norm, quite obviously. And even the norm of therapy would be different. So you would, even observing the same type of symptoms, like pragmatically speaking, you would recommend completely different approach to the therapy, right? It all depends on how you construct your norm. The first norm, I mean, the norm of health. Like your vision of a human being, essentially. And here we should probably talk about the difference between so-called material and so-called spiritual worlds, where, you know, well, okay, so my general statement about all of that would be that it's a stupid and unnecessary division of the world into material and spiritual. I mean, like it really looks superficial, and it's just it might work only as a conditional approximation to whatever we observe, and because, well, as you might remember from some of my videos, I've claimed that basically both material and spiritual objects are constructed in pretty much the same manner. Like, for example, in my video, again, Onion of Aliens Part 2, I've talked about the construction of the concept of atom, which cannot be produced without the concept of the soul, which is like spiritual thing, etc. And in my video about mythology, mythology as a cultural basis, I've talked about the construction of objects in general, and I've made a claim that, like, for example, explaining lightning by Zeus and by electrons is essentially the same thing, you know, on some level. So and even if you look at like modern Western, well, not just modern, but in general Western so-called material medicine, right? You can easily notice that it constantly corrects itself. It constantly changes itself. Like, for example, some objects get redefined, they get shifted, etc. So it's not like everything is solid and material, even inside of this type of approach. So yeah, like, for example, well, okay, never mind. I wanted to say something stupid here, but anyway, even the Western so-called material medicine has to admit that it doesn't really cover everything in the world, right? Like, one good example for that would be placebo effect, because all the drugs, all the types of treatment, they are tested not against no treatment at all. They are tested against placebo. So even the material medicine actually admits that placebo, which is like a pure spirituality, if you like, has a significant importance in treatment, right? So yeah, it's like it's a way of admitting that, okay, in our picture of the world, there's like a huge hole right here, but we'll just take it for granted. We'll just call it placebo, and we'll try to deal with it in ways that our narrative allows, right? But we're not going to try to deconstruct it and explain it in any material sort of sense, because it's more or less impossible, right? So we'll just treat it as a black box of its own, right? So in this sense, one might say we've explained everything, right? Even though we have no idea what this thing is and how it works, etc. So yeah, so material world, again, is not really that seamless as it might look, on the surface at least. So you have to constantly deal with those anomalies, and you have to, well, yeah, take them into account somehow, basically. That's what I'm saying. And another, well, you might probably bring up the point that, well, you see, material medicine is actually more successful, you know, but is it really? Like, if you think about it, well, I'll bring up 2 points. Well, one point is that without the supporting networks, the cultural networks of, let's say, positivistic science and engineering, the material-based medicine would actually kind of suck. It would look very weak and like without any basis. So like it only has the political power it does have only because it kind of pretends to be friends with engineering, let's say, right? And since engineering has all those accomplishments like mobile phones and whatever, then the medicine also pretends to stem from the same root, right? I mean, the material medicine, whereas in fact it isn't. I mean, it works with completely different phenomena, etc. But that's a very long discussion. But my point here is that on its own, it's pretty weak, and it has to be proven that it's even that it's effective, basically, right? That's what I'm saying. Well, that's one point. And the second point is that the scale, just the bulk amount of resources that are devoted for development of material medicine is just incompatible to the resources that are devoted to developing spiritual medicine, right? So it's not at all obvious that spiritual medicine, given the same amount of resources, would have had worse results. It's doubtful, I would say. Like if you imagine let's imagine some super far-fetched case, like let's say some shaman in some, I don't know, village in Indonesia has some system of treatment of people. So if you pull as much resources into this shaman's system as you do with, Western material medicine, I'm not at all convinced that the results would be worse than the results that we're seeing today with our medicine. I mean, that it doesn't seem obvious at all that the results would be worse, and hopefully, well, maybe some of the points I'm going to make further in this video would illustrate this point better, but just try to make this thought experiment in your mind, at least. So, okay. And again, even in the domain of the material Western medicine, we observe constant transformations, like objects, again, as I've already mentioned, they constantly get redefined, reshaped, etc., and kind of shifted with respect to each other. So it's all mutable. It's all very mutable. And well, one example you might think about is the definition of organ, or rather the recognition of organs. Like recently there has been some developments in recognizing what is called interstitium in human tissues. Like it was literally discovered a couple of years ago. It was previously unseen because nobody looked for it, and you have to implement some sophisticated visualizing technique. So what it is basically like an intercellular matrix, I guess, some sort of like a dendritic fractal type of thing that permeates most of the tissues in the human body. And it wasn't, as I've said, it wasn't even known before like a couple of years ago. So go figure. And and there's more and more recognition, let's say, that even the concept of organ is not really helpful. Like you should really consider a human organism as a system, so not just isolated elements, but elements plus connections between them. But even this view is already outdated, it's like system is really an oversimplification of what a human being is, because, well, okay, there's one other, let's say, type of object you might think about, not a system, but a medium, for example. So medium is not really a system, it's a completely different object, roughly speaking, and considering a human being as a medium rather than a system is another way of looking at a human being. Again, quite actually not really consistent with the view of a human being as a system. And why is considering human being as a medium important? Well, for example, recent advancements in recognition of the role of symbiotic organisms really leads us to believe that human being is only a medium where they exist, like symbiotic bacteria, gut bacteria, etc., bacteria in your skin and in your blood, perhaps, etc. Well, not really bacteria, probably, but some organisms, let's say. So yeah, and so all these views, as you can see, they're very, very different, even in this, under this same umbrella of materialistic view, let's say. But okay, so in general, to kind of sum up this small segment, I would say that there is no qualitative difference between material and spiritual medicine or view of the world in general. Basically, so I just propose to drop them altogether, this division, let's say. I would say that the only thing that really matters, again, returning to the points I've made multiple times in my previous videos, the only thing that matters is the ability to form cultural alliances, to form these networks, and the longer the better. So essentially a political power, right? So the longer the networks that you are able to build are, the more political power you have. So the medicine that would be able to mobilize all kinds of cultural resources would be the strongest. And it's not at all obvious that it's our medicine. Okay. And now the important point that I wanted to make is in this video, which I shall, let's say, I'll bring two arguments in his favor. So the point is that medicine is not science, period. And in particular, one of the arguments in the favor of this view is that medicine only, like, it's not science when it deals with a single individual, with a single person, because science never deals with single entities. On a single entity, you cannot build a law, a dependence of some sort, etc. It's not science at all. Like, something unique is not an object of scientific scrutiny. That's all, pretty much. So medicine might only be scientific, let's say, when it deals with large populations. So let's say repeating cases of a human being or something to that effect. Again, as I've already stated, the construction of the second norm, the norm of disease, requires you to compare many, many human beings, right? So that's why, since medicine can only be scientific when it works with large populations, it's so obsessed with statistics, I believe. Because, well, basically doctors admit that the result of treatment is not guaranteed, you know. So these black boxes of our constructed norms of health, disease, and treatment, or therapy, they keep falling apart all the time and releasing those unidentified monsters and calamities. So any sort of treatment has, I mean, again, moving through the, well, in our current, let's say, setting, our current Western medicine. So any sort of treatment to be scientific, or rather the very requirement of scientificness, ergo using the statistics of any sort of treatment, it means that it only has some probability of being successful, right? So there are some attempts, let's say, to patch all those holes all those seams where the world kind of keeps tearing itself apart. I mean, our materialistic world. So people invent things like personal intolerance of certain drugs, let's say. So they try to exclude, you know, an individual from the consideration, right? They're saying, oh, it's just your own problem. You're just intolerable to this drug, so go away. But the population as a whole feels okay, right, with the drug. So they're trying to, again, invent some ad hoc explanations, just like with placebo example. But anyway, long story short, like, bottom line is that medicine treats a population, really. This mythical average person, this constructed normal human being, right? And in any individual case, even if we did everything properly, all the procedures, even if we believe that statistics works and mathematics works, which is a completely different question, and it's a much bigger question, I would say, but we're not going to address it. But let's say we just take it for granted and say, okay, it's rooted in reality somehow, whereas that's not the case. But again, it's a completely separate discussion. So even if we take it for granted, a treatment of individual would be based on chance, essentially, on probability, right? That's what it boils down to. And so the results are statistical, just like gambling, pretty much, you know. You probably know that statistics actually rose from gambling initially, and yeah, makes a lot of sense, I would say. And the better the results of treatment would be, the closer you are, or this particular individual is, to the norm, to this pre-constructed norm for which apparently, or at least supposedly, the treatment works, right? Okay, so that was one point why medicine is not science. Again, to sum it up, because it deals with, because a human being is unique, basically, that's the point. And medicine, as it is applied to a human being, is not science because it is unique. Whereas it might be sort of scientific when it is applied to a large population, if we treat each member of this population as the same as all the other members, which is also not correct. But again, well, sort of, you know. Okay, so medicine is not science for that reason, and it is also not science for ideological reason, if you like, and in particular because it contains ethical component. So it says, we want to bring you to this normal state that we have pre-constructed for you, whether you like it or not. This is the norm. You know, you should be in this norm. So this is a value system, right? So it's an ethical component. You should do that and that and that. We should do that and that and that. So this is ethics, and science is not about ethics. Science never has ethical component. Science, again, as I've probably stated, I don't know where, probably in my previous video about Peterson, I've stated that science is about if-then type of statements. It's never about you should, you know, this Hume's guillotine, David Hume, the British philosopher, who said that you cannot derive an ought from is, right? So ethics and science are separate things completely. So medicine, and again, I've heard this thought from Peterson himself, and Peterson actually states that medicine is not science also, and he says that it's more like a branch of engineering, really, because, well, in engineering, well, it's my thoughts, not Peterson's, but in engineering, we want to make a certain thing work as we want it to work. So that's exactly what we have in medicine. We want a person to be as we want it to be, like to transpose them into this normal state, right? Which we have preset initially again. So, yeah. I've kind of interrupted myself, so I kind of forgot what I wanted to say. But yeah, so that's another argument in favor of the statement that medicine. I was talking about Hume's guillotine. What did I wanted to say? Damn. There was something else I wanted to say. But okay, the point is that ethical statements and scientific statements are completely different thing. Like, yeah. So science is about if-then type of statements, and ethics is about you should statements. And what you cannot derive one from the other, essentially. Okay. And well, you might say in general that abnormal diseases and treatment of those, thus, considering everything I've said just now, are unknown to medicine because, well, again, because it works with the population, it doesn't work with a single human being. And even rare diseases, like let's say with some, you know, a classical example of some rare disease with some double last name, you know, in its title, and one of the last names is probably some weird nationality like Hungarian or Polish, and the other one is like Jewish or something, like Gretzky-Bergman syndrome, something like that. I don't know. So even those rare diseases are already kind of creeping into the field of view of medicine. So they are already recognized, you know, they are already they have already been put in a black box and labeled, right? So we have this Gretzky-Bergman syndrome. But again, it doesn't concern like really rare stuff, like really individual stuff, not rare. Rare is actually a wrong word here, because individual stuff is present in any human being, whereas rare stuff, again, even if it's labeled, it might not be so prevalent. So basically what I'm saying is that even those rare things are normalized already in some sense, but each individual would face like series of unwanted states in their life, and perhaps some of them would be chronic, right? And they would be completely unidentifiable by medicine, because again, average human, let's say, just don't have these problems, right? It's you, the individual, who has those problems. So in some sense, it's your own problem, right? So at the very best, if you would address a doctor with those problems, and they wouldn't be able to recognize your personal condition, because it doesn't fit any of the black boxes, or it fits like half of them simultaneously, right? They would say, well, something like, well, you know, eat properly, you know, have some physical exercises, you know, rest well, and everything would be hunky-dory, you know. Much like the same manner, you know, a priest might have said, well, I mean, if you address them with the same problem, they would say, oh, well, you know, do fasting, confessions, like communion and pray, and everything would be hunky-dory, you know. It's the same type of approach. And again, as I've already stated, there are many types of medicine, and both of those things that I've listed, that I've just quoted, so to speak, are a medicine, even this advice of a priest. It's just that they have different they have different norms. Their norm of health, disease, and therapy are constructed in a different manner, but essentially they're the same. It's the same type of cultural pattern, that's what I'm saying. So both of those things are medicine. That's my claim. Okay, so, and there's a very interesting thing I wanted to mention, is that, well, imagine that a treatment has been produced, or how do you say it? A treatment has been implemented, let's say, but the patient died. So what would you do in that situation? Well, here you might have what I would call doctor's fallacy, or doctor's sophism, if you like. And I haven't heard anyone else talk about it, but I think it's really fascinating. So imagine again, a patient died despite the treatment, right? So the doctor might say, and they would probably say that, like whatever the circumstances have been, something to the effect that, you know, well, if we didn't step in, she would die even faster, you know. And like, why do I say she? It's because, you know, the mortality among men is higher, and obviously, I mean, that's a product of evil patriarchy, so we need equality, we need to raise mortality among women. So, way to go, sisters, you know. So anyway, that's what I would call a sophism, doctor's sophism, or doctor's fallacy, that even though the patient died, so the treatment completely failed, they say, well, if we didn't start the treatment, they would die even quicker, you know. It's that type of sophism. So it's this spectacular, I would say, overconfidence in your own system, that even total failure of your methods you interpret as a partial success, let's say. So it's kind of ridiculous, but it is what it is. Like it's that really. This is how deep a certain medicine might, and how would you say it, integrate itself into the culture, that you don't even doubt it a single bit, right? I'm sorry. So let's talk a little bit about political aspect of the thing. So when governments introduce themselves, let's say, into the field, and they start supporting certain medicine, obviously you have a quite a ripe field, if that's even an expression, for corruption. Because no competition, I mean, government induces violence, so it forces people to behave in a certain manner, like, let's say, follow a certain type of medicine. So no competition, so it suppresses the competition, this violence. Again, it breeds corruption, right? So in medical systems, we don't really have competition today. Everything is, we have this, you know, WHO, we have the national medical organizations, etc., which deliberately suppress competition between different medical systems. So they ban or even put in jail people who practice, you know, different methods of treatment, etc., who use different concepts, different norms. So when your system is not exposed to this external criticism, when you suppress competition, well, monopoly arises, and with a monopoly you have degradation, solidification, well, again, obviously corruption, and general loss of efficiency. So the certain type of medicine is able, with the help of government, just like in economy, I mean any economical system with the help of government, as I've discussed many times in my previous videos. So this system of medicine is able, with the help of government, to force its way through those cultural networks, right? It might force into submission a large swaths of culture, just because it has the big daddy government behind its back, right? And so, yeah, and I've already mentioned the same problem in science, like when governmental institutions basically ban what they think is pseudoscience, etc. So if you're interested in this topic, watch my videos about pseudoscience, about the cult of Einstein and Hawking, and about science and anarchy. Okay, so, and again, I wish to reiterate one of my points from previous videos, that truth is political, right? Where, again, I treat the word political or politics in a very broad sense. And by that I mean politics my definition of politics in this case is politics is the decision making in a situation of conflict of interests. So let's say you have two conflicting theories or two conflicting medicines, ergo you have politics that way or another. It's just how different wills to power ensembles arrange themselves in a political manner, essentially. So truth is political, and it depends on the level of truthness. I guess I've talked about that in my Nature of Knowledge video. It depends on the length of the networks that you can draw from this particular node, let's say, this particular cultural phenomenon, like Western material medicine or whatever. And you can draw these networks. So government also has a lot of influence in culture. So it might reinforce your network sort of in an unjustified manner, like you didn't really deserve that, in some sense. But it does that, just like in economy again. So, so it all leads to corruption, and it all leads to slowing the progress down. And like what is not so frequently recognized is that, again, those political networks, they're mutable, they change over time. And like what we consider a good medicine today, a good treatment, maybe in 100 years would be considered barbarism, like a complete ignorance, etc. Just like today we consider a medicine of 100 years ago, at least in some respects, quite barbaric and stupid and incoherent, etc. So it there's no argument in favor of statement that it wouldn't happen with our medicine, right? In fact, I would claim that it would happen. Like the current day medicine would be considered barbaric, maybe even sooner than 100 years, maybe even in 50 years or something like that. So yeah, it's all really shaky, all this foundation, So, okay, so what was I talking about? Yeah, so that way or another, this political support from the government leads to the situation when, again, this monopolistic situation when even the failure of treatment is interpreted in favor of medicine, right? Like, let's say, oh, we did everything right. I mean, the medicine is correct. It's just this was a wrong diagnosis, let's say. Or, oh, the medicine is correct, but it was just a wrong treatment of this diagnosis. Or, oh, the medicine is correct, but it's just some unique case, so sod off, It's, again, your own problem. It's your individual, how do you say it? Intolerance or something like that. Or again, you might utilize doctor's fallacy if anything else fails. You might say, we did everything right, and it's your own problem that you died in the process. Like, get this waste away from here, buried quickly, etc. So, yeah. So truth is really conventional. It depends on all of those networks combined, on all of the culture fundamentally, on government, like the medicine that you adhere to depends on all those political influences on you, including, again, the government, your religion and ethics and philosophy, the science you are aware of, the authority of your friends and relatives and neighbors and whatever. So all of that might influence your own allegiance towards this or that type of medicine, etc. Right? It should be pretty obvious, I hope. Okay, and strictly speaking, kind of trying to sum this whole thing up, in objects of medicine, we observe clearly those deep cracks and kind of crevices and fractures, just as ones I've already mentioned with placebo, individual problems, etc. And basically, you might say that medicine that particular kind of medicine that you're dealing with currently, I mean currently, not right now, but anyhow, like any time, whatever other medicine would take its place, you would still have the same situation. So medicine is true only as long as you don't fall into those cracks and fractures, right? Because if you do, well, you would be too concerned to criticize medicine, you know, because, well, again, as I've said, there's like everything, all the bad things are in those cracks, right? As long as you stay on the surface, as long as you are approximated by this average human being, everything is okay. But if you manage to fall into those cracks, in these neat and shiny objects of medicine, well, you're in big trouble. So you would be so concerned with your own well-being, you would be suffering a lot. You wouldn't have any time to criticize medicine, right? So we have this survivor bias in some sense here, because, well, you might just say simply that we don't hear, I would say, we don't hear critics of medicine just because most of them are not alive anymore, you know. So they weren't able to deal with those problems, and medicine just doesn't even recognize them. I mean, it works in its small domain, and it's full of cracks, and if somebody fell through, well, tough luck, tough noogies, you know. But we have our own domain still, and it's kind of pristine. So yeah, kind of like that. And I was thinking also that medicine might be a tool. It's not like a conspiracy theory or anything, but just in the way of how cultural ensembles naturally organize. I was thinking about it, that medicine might be a tool of evolutionary selection, an additional tool, I should add. Like it's the way to normalize the population in some sense, right? Because medicine works with a normal person, with an average person, etc. So you kind of pass the whole society through this meat grinder of medicine, and whoever survived, they survive, and they're like closer to average than otherwise, than without medicine, you know. So anomalous people, you know, really weird people, they're not only not quite fit to the world as it is, but even more so, they're not quite fit to the medicine itself. So medicine actually acts as an additional tool for normalizing the population, eliminating the, you know, these tails of the distribution. And obviously it hits men more because, again, as I've stated in my gender video, the distributions of almost all the parameters for men are wider. So there's going to be more anomalous men in any kind of respect, basically, than women, I mean. So yeah, anomalous people die thanks to medicine, not only thanks to the world as it is. And you might think about this practice of punitive medicine, right? Where it's actually the government enforces medicine to get rid of the anomalies, let's say, right? For example, people who don't support the predominant political views, they're just stigmatized as sick or something like that and removed with the help of punitive medicine. Like Michel Foucault had a large study on this subject, the concept of madness, and how it was used to, again, normalize populations, you know, to eliminate your political opponents, etc., etc. Okay, and yeah, so I've pretty much ended with this segment, this long one. So I've promised at the beginning that I'm gonna give you an example of not human beings being treated in the same manner, in the same medicinal manner, so to speak. So, oh yeah, returning, probably when I talked about ethics, I wanted to mention this Hippocrates principle, noli nocere, do not harm your patient or something like that. So that's also an ethical aspect, but okay, never mind. So I promised you an example of non-anthropic, let's say, objects being treated in the same manner. And there you go. So my example would be global warming. So again, here we should construct the same norms for the medicine to exist, right? So first norm is the normal planet, which is the planet Earth as it was with all the parameters, the distribution of masses, the temperatures, the chemical composition, etc., as it was roughly in years 1800s to 1950 or something like that, like roughly this time period. So this is a normal planet, Earth, in that time period. Then we should construct a normal disease, where we say that, okay, a disease is such that a rise in concentration of CO2 gives rise to average temperature in this normal Earth, okay? And then we need to construct the normal treatment for that, where we say, well, we reduce CO2 and the temperature, the average temperature drops, okay? Or at least stays the same, doesn't rise anymore. And as you probably can figure out already, there are a lot of problems, like really a lot of problems, and the really serious ones with this type of narrative. And really sloppily constructed objects are present here. Like, for example, we might ask a question with regards to the first point, this first norm, normal planet. We might ask, well, why is this norm limited to those years, to this time period, like 1800 to 1950, roughly? So, I mean, it's obvious that planet back then was different than now, but so it was in any other time period. I mean, by definition, in some sense, you're claiming, if you use this as the norm, that most of the time of its existence, planet Earth was in abnormal state, right? Just by definition, because your norm only includes this particular period. So isn't that strange? I don't know. Maybe we should expand it for like 1 million years at least. Maybe that would be a good idea. Okay, so the second question you might ask about the second norm, or rather, well, okay, let's talk about this one first. Like, why do we construct this particular parameter, this average temperature? Because it's not hard to see that it's a purely fictional parameter. You cannot measure it. You can only calculate it. It's not observed anywhere in reality. Average temperature is a fiction, again. So, yeah, there's a proverb in Russian, well, not really a proverb, but a saying that to measure an average temperature in a hospital, which is, again, fitting for our topic, meaning that, different patients in a hospital have different temperatures, and this temperature might be symptoms of completely different diseases, but again, you kind of sum it up and average it and try to make conclusions from this average temperature, which is rubbish, obviously. And again, returning to my topic that medicine works with averages, so it's also rubbish. It's not scientific. You have to address each individual on their own grounds, so to speak, but medicine doesn't do that. And science cannot even do that. But that's another story for another day. So a third thing we might ask is that why do we think that temperature, the average, this fictional, mythical average temperature, changes with CO2 concentration? Because, like, for example, observations show us, like these proverbial ice cores from Antarctica and Greenland, they show us that change in CO2 concentration actually follows changes in temperature, right? So something doesn't quite add up here, right at the observational side. But again, you might claim that if the normal planet existed only in 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, those observations are also abnormal, right? It was an abnormal, anomalous planet Earth, right? Or something to that effect. Well, fair enough, I guess. And like, I have serious doubts about this greenhouse effect in the first place, you know. Again, I might be wrong, and perhaps even I am wrong, but still, I'm not convinced that such a thing exists in the first place. Like, there are serious problems, as far as I can tell, with all these radiation laws and their applicability to Earth, you know. But okay. What I know for sure is that if you take into account all the bodies with atmospheres in the solar system, you can claim that their, again, fictional average mean temperatures might be built as a single function. All the bodies fit this function only as a function of solar radiation, I mean the amount of heat from the sun, electromagnetic emission, and the pressure, atmospheric pressure, and that's all. That's only two parameters that you need. So a reasonable conclusion from that would be that spectral whateverness doesn't play any role. So it seems like the atmosphere only plays a role of adiabatic heating of the planet. Like the atmosphere compresses under its own weight just due to gravity, and it heats up, just like if you use your bicycle pump and you kind of compress the air and it gets hotter. It's that type of effect. I mean, that's why planets with atmospheres in general are hotter than planets without atmospheres, right? So, but even if we take this at face value, I mean, the greenhouse effect, well, water vapor already blocks all those frequencies occupied by CO2 in absorption. So, go figure. So, I would say that this idea, this whole medicine of global warming, is not supported at any level at all, and it seems super far-fetched. And you might say, well, there's a clear political interest behind it, and I would agree. So I would say that it's a typical example of what I call scientific pyramid. Again, see my video about pseudoscience and scientific pyramids. Even though I have to also note here, in contrast to all the anti-global warming activists, that they also have their own political interests. Even if not in literal sense, like oil companies don't really pay them or something like that for their anti-global warming activism, but they have political interests of their own, at least in the realm of science, you know. They're saying, we don't agree with your network, with your political scientific network of global warming. We have our own network of anti-global warming. That's what I'm saying. So politics doesn't vanish if you're against global warming, right? Even if nobody pays you to do that. You're still engaged in the same game of power. You're trying to address reality, let's say, in such a manner that would give you more resources. Whether that would be a better explanation of reality plus some, you know, fame and authority and credibility, etc., etc. So all of that is about power, as I've said many times. Okay. And the icing on the cake about global warming is obviously it's just a brilliant thing that the main source of heating of the planet, the sun, is not even considered at all in all those models, in the medicine of global warming. So it's just, yeah, it's brilliant. I love it. Okay, so all those patterns, I believe, that I've listed, and global warming in particular, it has a clear connection to what I call repentive thinking. Again, see my video on repentive thinking. It's the same scheme, you know. We had and medicine in general, it's the same repentive thinking type of thing. We have a golden age, this, you know, first norm of health, Then we have an evil villain that ends the golden age with their ill doings, let's say, and that would be norm of disease. And we have the norm of treatment, which is the proposed way to nullify the ill doings of a villain and return to the golden age, right? And so, as I've stated in my repentive thinking video, many branches of culture stem from that same pattern, like Marxism, psychoanalysis, ecological movement, again speaking about global warming, modernization in economics also follows from that, and it's all based on Christian repentance, this act of confessing for your sins, repenting, and kind of returning to the golden age of sinless existence, so to speak, or again, all those new age idiots who claim that you, first and foremost, you need to get rid of toxins, you know. So that's the same type of thinking. Or Scientological auditing, which is kind of a mixture of psychoanalysis and whatever else, and Christian repentance, I guess. It's the fruit of the same tree, let's say. And the medicine is also the same cultural process, fundamentally. Okay, so I suppose the camera is not working anymore, but who cares? Let's jump into the conclusions finally. Now, what did I say in this video? Well, what I've said was that the essence of medicine is really in constructing three norms: the norm of health, the norm of disease, and the norm of therapy or treatment. And so essentially, normal treatment is something that gets a normal human rid of normal disease. So that's what medicine is all about. And medicine is not applicable to an individual, not applicable. It treats only the average human being. And therefore, it is not scientific, because science doesn't work with unique phenomena. It only works with repeating phenomena. And to bypass this bottleneck, so to speak, medicine uses statistics. So let's say even if in 40% of cases the treatment doesn't help, well, if in 60% of cases it does help, well, we shall use that. It's fine. Or something to that effect. And also another point, another argument in favor of the statement that medicine is not scientific is the fact that medicine contains this ethical component in it. So it says that we want to bring you to the norm as we constructed it, right? So it's an ethical statement. It's not that scientific statements are about if-then type of structure, not about you should or we should type of structure, which is ethics. So, as again, I'm repeating the thought of the brilliant idea of Jordan Peterson. Again, see my video about Jordan Peterson. His idea that the medicine is really a branch of engineering rather than science. Okay, so in the end result is that going to a doctor is like gambling, right? Because, well, it's statistical, so result is not guaranteed, just like in gambling, pretty much. And vice versa, you might say. You might invent your own methods of treatment, or maybe borrow your friend's methods or whatever, which medicine would even never be able to acknowledge, because it doesn't treat you, you know, with your methods. I mean, it treats an average, normal human being, but not you. An average, normal human being have their normal diseases and not yours. So nobody permits you, or at least hopefully, I mean, we're kind of moving in that direction where the government would permit you to do everything, but still, you can still invent your own methods of treatment, because they would fit you with your specific individual traits and your specific individual conditions, which are completely out of scope of medicine, right? Because it works with an average, with a norm, with all these constructed fictitious objects. It doesn't really care about you, frankly. You're just a number in their statistics, right? Okay. Well, not a very optimistic note, but or maybe it is, you know. After all, maybe you would be encouraged to search, to know yourself, you know, this super famous quote, which is kind of super stupid and ridiculous, but because it basically asks for something impossible. But anyway, yeah. Hopefully it would inspire you. That's what I'm saying. Don't be afraid to tell all those doctors to use their own methods on themselves and not on you. Okay, thank you for watching. The eons are closing.